Okay. So tonight we're really going to start talking about Chapter 1. And if you look through, which I'm sure you did with the adaptive learning quiz, Chapter 1 is really kind of an introduction to payroll and a lot of laws. So what I thought I'd do, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint, and we're not going to go through the whole thing. The first chapter of homework is like multiple choice over all of this, since there's no hands-on activities in the first chapter. So with that being said, I gave you 2 attempts on the first homework. Because it's multiple choice, there's no check my work on just Chapter 1 homework. So it's all multiple choice or matching or whatnot. So I just gave you 2 attempts. That way if you screw up the first time, you can take it again. It's the same questions. But then moving into when we start Chapter 2 next week, you will see the homework actually have exercises that you'll complete. So check my work will be unlimited. And you still have as many, like, unlimited attempts. So even if you submit it for a grade and you forgot something or missed something, you can go back in and fix it, okay? So before we get started, I just kind of wanted to go over that stuff again, just the flow of the class. So really, again, we have 6 chapters to cover. Some of the chapters have more information in them. All of them have more than in Chapter 1. So what we'll do is the first night of the chapter, like when we get to Chapter 2, is we'll have a discussion / exercises that we work together. So I'll kind of go over some main points of the chapter, and we'll work through problems together. That way you guys can get the examples you need. And then like the next week in Chapter 2 will be kind of more examples if you want them, or just time to work on the chapter. Because we have kind of that leeway with this chapter, with these chapters. So it'll be kind of a more shortened lecture since we are only here 1 night a week, but we'll also have time in class for questions and hands-on doing the work. I think that's important with payroll, to just practice, practice, practice. So that way you'll have time in class when I'm here to ask questions to get through the material. So again, with Chapter 1, we're only going to spend 1 night on it though, since it's multiple choice. So I thought we'd just kind of talk about a little bit, go through. I pulled up the PowerPoint just to have talking points. And we talk about just a little bit, again, of where we're going in the whole class, and kind of some supplemental stuff, like links that I put out for you guys to kind of look at. Because you'll find with payroll, like, we're going to focus on federal law in here. So we're talking about, federal laws that are applied to all 50 states. But that's the focus of the book, because obviously there's 50 different states with 50 different payroll laws that actually are different for, depending on every state. I think I said that. I'm repeating myself. But anyway, so what I've done to kind of supplement on that is, since we live in Oklahoma, I want to provide you with some resources about Oklahoma payroll law. So if you're doing payroll in Oklahoma, it's going to be different than doing payroll in Texas or California or Arizona or wherever. So the federal laws are kind of like blanket base laws, and then state laws are usually more specific. So state laws usually trump, I guess would be a good way to say, the federal law. So we're going to, as long as state laws meet federal laws, does that make sense? So there may be, the minimum wage for federal payroll is $7.25 an hour. Oklahoma actually adheres to that, and we do not have a higher minimum wage than the federal. But California does, and there's other states that have made their own minimum wage, and that's going to apply to that state instead of the federal law. So that's why payroll is interesting as far as researching and looking at payroll. Payroll is also sort of like tax, that it changes. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that affect payroll going into, especially this year. Payroll law did change. With withholdings changing, you've probably heard, hopefully, when Trump administration passed some withholding tax changes, which do affect payroll. Hopefully you saw a little increase in pay from that, but it does affect, how we are actually running payroll, the laws that we're applying. So it's important in Chapter 1, we're going to talk about some payroll laws. If you process payroll, you do have to stay on top of these changes so that you're doing your due diligence and reporting things that are accurate and up to date with the law. So there's just some basic stuff like computing gross wages, but there's little intricacies and little exceptions and everything. So we're going to learn how to do a lot of the basic payroll. But then if you do payroll, you're going to follow your company's procedures and adhere to Oklahoma law or wherever you may be. So really, again, this chapter, it's just kind of giving you an overview, talking about, you can do anything from payroll clerk to senior payroll manager. A payroll administrator can earn somewhere between $45,000 and $60,000 a year for 2016 figures. So there is a need still for payroll processing. People think, oh, well, that's something that can be done automatically, processing payroll, just clicking some buttons. That's not entirely true, because you still need someone who knows the laws and how to interpret the laws and how to compute things, especially if the computer screws it up. You need to be able to explain what happened. So it's important to have someone in it. Again, we're just going to hit kind of some of the highlights. We will be dealing a lot in this class with the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as the Federal Insurance Contribution Act. So the Fair Labor Standards Act will cover a lot more in Chapter 2, but it's really just setting some basic guidelines for, the amount of hours a person should work, how much they should get paid. It is what sets minimum wages. So again, we won't go into major detail on that one in this chapter, but it's just a good one to know that it affects payroll. So we have to know the Federal Labor Standards Act. FICA, you've probably heard of that. We studied it briefly in financial accounting. If you've taken that, I think you probably have by now. So those are withholdings for both Social Security and Medicare. And so FICA law states how much of our employees' earnings get withheld for Social Security and Medicare. And as we go through, again, I'll give you more accurate, like 2018 numbers, because the book was written, it's a 2017 book, but it was written in 2016. So some of the numbers with the new payroll laws haven't been updated fully. So we'll just use what we have in the book to calculate. It really doesn't matter what the limits are or what the percentages are, because we're just learning how to compute it, but it's always good to know what's going on. We have income tax withholding laws that tell us how much federal, state, and local income tax will be withheld from each employee's pay. Again, this differs based on where we live. In Oklahoma, we do have both federal and state withholding that we are subjected to, which you probably know from getting your own paycheck and paying taxes, right? So we will deal with that. We'll also deal with unemployment tax acts and how that affects us as an employer, and fair employment laws. And then there's other federal laws that impact as well. Again, state minimum wage and maximum hour laws, and then there's other state-specific laws that affect payroll. So as we get into those chapters with those specifics, I will try to find you information regarding Oklahoma, but you can always Google, payroll laws on a minimum wage for whatever state and find that information as well. Again, Fair Labor Standards Act, I'm not going to read all of this, but it does set minimum wage. So again, this is a federal minimum wage. States could have their own rate, but just higher. It provides equal pay for equal work provisions. So we're not allowed to pay people different amounts if they're doing the same jobs with the same qualifications. And it requires, the biggest thing that we need to remember with this is it requires records. So we have to keep records, which is important as an accountant because we're the ones keeping those records. So we have to keep payroll registers and keep track of time and how we're paying employees. It's very important. As I mentioned before, FICA, or Federal Insurance Contribution Act, it's two taxes. We have FICA, what we call Social Security, or OASDI, which you can see as your Old Age and Survivors Trust Fund, and the Federal Disability Insurance Trust Fund. And then you have your HI, which is your Health Insurance Plan, or Medicare. Again, we usually refer to OASDI as Social Security. It's easier than trying to say that over and over. And then HI as our Medicare. So we all, if we're getting a paycheck, we're all paying Social Security and Medicare out of our check. The employee and the employer are responsible for these, which again, we'll talk about those in detail when we get into actually doing withholdings. As you can see, covered in greater detail in Chapter 3. We just need to know when we're getting into payroll that this law does affect how we compute payroll. Again, same with income tax withholding. We already talked about how those are different. We're going to cover those in Chapter 4. Unemployment, again, this was something we kind of dipped into just a little bit in financial accounting when we were doing payroll liabilities. So you have FUTA and SUTA. FUTA is your federal unemployment tax, and SUTA is your state unemployment. Every state has its own regulations and laws on how much a company must contribute. Again, we will look at that when we go into Chapter 5, as you can see. And if you remember from financial accounting, we actually, if we're paying state unemployment, the employer is the one responsible for paying unemployment. The employees do not pay unemployment taxes. So the employer is the one paying it. And if we pay state, we actually get a credit towards the federal unemployment. Because really, federal unemployment pays to set up the unemployment programs and the laws that govern it, how we use it. The state unemployment tax is the one that's actually set up to provide unemployment benefits. So it makes sense that we're going to contribute more to a state fund, that if we have someone claiming unemployment, that's going to come out of the state fund. So it's out here, you know, state unemployment used to pay unemployment benefits. Whereas federal, it's used to pay state and federal administrative expenses, not the benefits themselves. Fair employment laws, we have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You probably know it as equal opportunity or equal employment opportunity. Again, that prohibits discrimination in the workplace. So we can't discriminate when hiring, firing, promoting, or compensating based on color, race, religion, national origin, or gender. So that's a very important thing. You've probably heard of that before. That everyone says they're an equal employment opportunity employer. Well, they have to be. It's like, I like how they give themselves that stamp of approval, but it's kind of a federal law. But, you know, I guess they like to say, oh, look, we follow the laws. And as you can see, that does apply to all employers that affect commerce. So anyone that has 15 or more workers has to follow those laws. If they can determine that discrimination is intentional, the employee that's been affected can seek compensation and punitive damages. And that's Civil Rights Act of 1991. And again, they give you a link there, and these PowerPoints are out on Canvas if you want to review them. So you can follow that, www.eeoc.gov, and get more information on the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. Another one that people probably don't hear of as much is the Age Discrimination in Employee Act. That actually came about in 1967. We can't discriminate based on age, and we're saying age as over 40 in this case. Now we know, again, this is one of those gray areas, right? It's kind of like discrimination in general. You have to be able to prove it. So that's the unfortunate situation a lot of workers face, even with the civil rights, is how do you prove that you were discriminated against, that you weren't hired because you were a certain class of individual or because you were 60. You know, it becomes hard to prove those things. You may get an inkling or you may hear, but unless there's some type of proof, it becomes very hard to do anything. And we do see that, unfortunately, where some places will try to demote or fire people that are closer to retirement, or maybe just don't want to hire someone that's closer to retirement. Yeah. That's what they do. It's unfortunate, and it's hard to prove that that's what they're doing because they'll find some reason. Yeah, unfortunately. But I think, you know, there is a law that protects against it, but again, there has to be some type of evidence that you were fired or not hired because you were in this certain age class. So Unless you have, a recording of someone saying, I'm choosing not to hire this person, which I have been in meetings where people are dumb enough to say those things, but if the potential is, they would have to obtain that, so it makes it a little harder. But they are out there to protect people. If that happens and it's very blatant, you can sue and get some kind of compensation. And you've probably heard of Americans with Disabilities Act, that just, again, if someone has a disability, it is an employer's job to not discriminate against that person if they can perform the job. They can't be someone coming in whose disability limits their ability to perform the job functions listed. That's not actually, discriminating. But if we're allowed to make a reasonable accommodation to allow that worker to do their job successfully, then we cannot use that as a reason to not hire. And you'll hear ADA other places too, like as students, we apply the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you can go get accommodations that'll allow for extra time, or, recording lectures and being able to use special software to zoom in on text and things like that. So there's some things we can make, arrangements for, and employees are supposed to do that too. But reasonable accommodation, it's a very vague term, because what's reasonable to me may not be reasonable to someone else. Providing a special chair or a special keyboard, okay, that's pretty reasonable. Remodeling your entire building to accommodate someone may not be reasonable, right? So again, that has to be determined by the court if someone were to sue and say, I wasn't hired because of this disability and they didn't make reasonable accommodations. So again, sometimes with any type of law, we get into like that gray area and that vague, but it's really up to the employer to determine what's reasonable or not, unless it goes to court. Okay.
So like the employer, like, say like the person that's wanting to have the job, they're like, I want this, and the employer's like, no, if you go to court, and so it's the court.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if they've made reasonable accommodations. Most places try to be accommodating, but it can be, some people can make demands that just aren't financially or feasible to, how the company operates. And so most of the time, I think the court is going to be pretty fair on that interpretation, try to be fair to both parties, but that can be very difficult. So hopefully it won't ever get to a court situation. But again, I mean, if you have, the best defense in this as an employer is that you have a job description that is very specific in the duties required. And so that you can prove that this person is unable to perform that job duty, then you're probably pretty protected in that case as an employer. And hopefully, people are understanding of the situation. So it just depends on the job. And yeah, it's a little vague, so it can be hard. And I'm sure we could Google that and find some interesting cases. That's the great thing about like payroll. Anytime there's a law, associated with it, you can always find something interesting. Let's see, we don't really need to worry about that. Really, some of this, like immigration reform and control, it just requires us to fill out an I-9 on every employee to verify that they're actually an authorized legal worker in the United States. Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, is also kind of another interesting one, because that's usually the thing that most employees tend to debate about and the interpretation. A lot of people think that you get paid leave under FMLA, but that's not the case. It's actually unpaid leave. All it really does is it gives you up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and it protects your position. But when I say position, when you come back, they can actually put you in a position or an equal position. So you may not even, you're not guaranteed your exact position when you go on FMLA. It just has to be a comparable position. So I know this has come up. My mom's an elementary school teacher. They had a teacher take FMLA and miss 12 weeks. So when she came back, they put her in a different grade. So it's still the same pay, same job responsibilities, but she went from teaching like second to fourth or something. So that's considered a reasonable, change. And again, it's unpaid, and you have to have some kind of documentation that proves that you're allowed. It can be taken in 12 weeks consecutively, or depending on the situation or the condition, it can be broken up. So an example, I know my friend talked about this one. Someone that she worked with had like an autoimmune disease, like I can't remember, it may have been lupus, for example. So she, got documentation from her doctor and got approved for FMLA. So she could actually use FMLA to protect her position if she had like a flare-up, I guess is what they call it. So she may be out for 3 days and she could say, okay, it's covered under FMLA. So she still may or may not, submit for sick leave, but at least she won't be written up or, So most of the time it's more for 6 weeks or 12 weeks because it's a recovery from surgery, or, we think a lot about childbirth or caring for an adopted child even, or critical care for a spouse or parents or whatnot. But yeah, it can actually be, if it's a qualifying event, it can be that 12 weeks can be split up over a 12-month period. It just depends.
Does it matter on the size of the company? Is there a certain limit? Is it not over 50 employees though?
I don't.
Yeah, it has to be over 50
Yeah.
employees.
Yeah, you have to be over 50 employees. So yeah, that's true. It's only, I guess it's right there, isn't it? I like reading it.
Yeah, and that 75-mile radius is tricky. It's like my company, they are under 50 within the 75 miles. But if you included all the whole company, then it would be more than 50. But because it's within the 75, they don't qualify for FMLA. So like when I went on maternity leaves, it was their own policy. Nothing like that was covered.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Yeah, when it's small companies, it's unfortunate. I feel like it should be covered regardless of the size. But yeah, it does. There are stipulations to that. And that does, hopefully your company have decent policies in place. Did they have policies, or you have?
They did, yeah.
Okay.
It was only 3 weeks. And so I just had vacation.
Yeah.
I took 10 weeks, but it was
3 weeks.
3 weeks paid, yeah.
Okay, so they get 3 weeks paid.
Yeah,
okay, but you could take the 10 weeks. It was just your own.
My own.
Okay. I guess that's not too bad, because a lot of companies, anywhere I've worked, has had no paid. It just is whatever sick or vacation time you've accrued.
Right.
So, yeah, which is interesting too. I mean, that's a whole other opening a can of worms when you talk about maternity leave, because have you ever looked at the differences in countries? Like the U.S. is down on the bottom as far as maternity leave and paternity leave go, because a lot of companies don't offer any type of paid leave. And other companies or other countries allow several months.
Like even California is different. Like I moved from California to Oklahoma while I was pregnant. And in California, you can take like a year of maternity leave because it's FMLA and then like something else and then disability.
I like short term. And
right. So they have like all these little things you can stack on to get like a year. So my friend who was pregnant at the same time did that and took off a whole year.
Wow.
And I moved to Oklahoma and it was like, okay, I get
You get screwed.
There's
no better term.
Cool. So it's like even 9 days between Oklahoma and California.
Yeah, that's why the laws are so different, because the state can set their own laws, and so it varies so widely. Again, federal covers every state, but then the state can have more specific laws. And I know we can still do like short-term disability, but you have to have already signed up for that. So like we have the option of paying for short-term disability through American Fidelity or whatnot, but you can't be pregnant when you sign up. So it's considered a pre-existing. So if you're already signed up, then you get up to, I think short-term covers up to 12 weeks, I think. Short-term disability, you can actually use that and get disability pay for your maternity leave. But again, you have to plan ahead or just pay for it, in advance until that happens. So it's kind of one of those. And then we've dealt with it here at the college recently with FMLA. As faculty, we've had issues because FMLA is 40 hours a week is what it goes off of. And so then through payroll, they require you to take 40 hours of leave per week. Well, technically as faculty, we're 30-hour-a-week contract. We're full-time, but we're 30 hours is what our contract states. But if we're taking FMLA, we have to take 40 hours of leave a week. So it gets really tricky. So that's when I say, like, some of these laws and interpretations, there's not a lot of guidance. And then it's how, you know, the school interprets the law. And I mean, you know, I would never sue, because honestly, we accrue sick leave based on 40 hours a week. So I'm like, well, then that makes sense that we have to take 40 hours of leave, even if we're not technically here 40 hours. You know, we're getting the benefits based on a 40-hour week. I'm fine with it. But some faculty were, you know, concerned, which I get. If you've only got so much leave accrued, and then you're having to take 6 weeks of leave, and you're having to get charged 40 hours, it gets kind of tricky. So FMLA can be very tricky. All of these can be, because again, you always have these, and I think we're seeing that even more. I mean, very rarely do you see workers that work truly 8 to 5, 40 hours a week, right? I mean, everyone's going to different schedules, or you have flex time, or you work from home, or, you know, it seems like as our pay or as our schedules are evolving, these laws are becoming very hard to apply and interpret. So I think we're going to see with payroll law it becoming even more tricky on how we write up our company policies. Again, because here, you know, when we brought it up in Faculty Senate, well, why are we getting charged 40 hours a week when it says we work 30? They're like, well, we can charge you 30, but then you would accrue on a 30, like, as, you know, on a 30-hour, so you would only accrue sick leave based on 30 hours. And I'm like, I'm good. But I understand, you know, it gets very tricky. So anyway, I find all of that very interesting, because I think we're going to run into that more and more when you have more people working from home or not working a typical 40-hour-a-week situation. And there are other requirements as far as, you know, what meets you. You have to continue health care coverage, the employer does, and again, you have the right to return to the same job or a comparable position. There are other requirements, so you had to have worked, I don't know if it tells you that on here. In order to qualify for FMLA, you had to have worked so many hours at the company. So I believe it equates to like 9 months to a year of full-time service. I'd have to look it up to be exact. I know when I got pregnant with my son, I'd only been at the company a couple months, so my leave was not covered under FMLA. So there are other provisions. So part-time employees, you know, or newer workers, if something happens, you may not be covered because you have to have accumulated a certain number of hours on the job at that place of employment to even qualify for FMLA. So there are some provisions. You can't walk in day 3 and be like, oh, hey, I need, you know, knee surgery, here's my FMLA. They're not, it's not covered. So that's, you know, kind of a good thing for employers as a protection, but not always the best for employees who can't always time when those things happen. Let's see. I'm not going to go into retirement income and all of that. It just sets, you know, for pensions and for how that is taken into consideration. Another law that is interesting that we'll cover more in Chapter 3 is the Affordable Care Act of 2010. This changed a lot of things as well as far as payroll and benefits and everything are concerned. One things it did was make wage earners that earned over $200,000 pay additional Medicare taxes. So not Social Security, but just like a Medicare, they had to pay a little additional tax. That's covered in Chapter 3. But we do have patient protection. And you've probably heard about some of this. I mean, I know a lot of people call it Obamacare, you know, it's like the slang term for the Affordable Care Act. Again, I think there's pros and cons. You know, there's some good things that came about, like if you have insurance, then if you've ever had private insurance, which I did, when I stayed at home with my son, to go on my husband's plan at the time would have cost us like $800 a month, and this was back in like 2005. It was ridiculous, and I was staying home. And so I, signed up for an independent plan through Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'd had continuous coverage of insurance, all of that. Well, you fill out all the forms, right, of what kind of problems you've had. Well, I had allergies, and I'd had like one other like female issue. So they didn't cover anything related to gynecology or allergies. So pre-existing conditions, even though I'd had continuous coverage and, those situations were pretty small, they're like, nope, we're going to limit coverage on those. We will not pay towards those things until you've been paying for like a year or two on the policy. So I couldn't go get allergy medication. This was back before there was as many over-the-counter options, and couldn't go for anything else. So unless I paid out of pocket. So one thing Affordable Care Act did was get rid of that pre-existing condition clause. So insurance companies have to cover, if you have a pre-existing. Now they may charge you a higher rate, but they have to cover it. So that makes a big difference. It also offered tax credits to small employers because we know, now it's required to have health insurance as an employee. Even if the employer is a certain size, they're required to offer it, or if you work full-time. But we know now as a tax-paying person, if you file taxes, you have to cover, have to have insurance coverage on yourself, or they charge you like a fee. So this is one good thing. It offered tax credits to small employers who offered health insurance to employees, because we know we had a lot of people that had no health coverage, even full-time employees. If you worked for like a small private company, they weren't offering you any type of benefits. And so you had to pay out of pocket with your own independent company. And so some of this was really helpful. So if an employer pays 50% or more of the cost of the premium, they get a credit of 50%. Okay? So at least they're incentivizing companies to actually provide their employees with health insurance benefits. So that's very important. Again, we have state laws, we have worker compensation. If someone gets injured on the job, those are determined by the state, and state disability benefit laws. We have to provide disability benefits as well. The last little part of the chapter just kind of talks about the payroll accounting systems in general. How, again, we're required to keep human resources and payroll records. So we have to keep forms, like the I-9, for example, to show verification of employment, W-2s, W-4s. All of those forms are important, and as well as like a record, both of the employee and what we're paying them. So obviously, the payroll department itself is accountable for those functions, and it's usually under the CFO that those functions are performed. So the record keeping, maintaining, payment, all of that. Some companies do outsource payroll, especially smaller companies that don't want to hire a person to process payroll. So you will see that companies will hire someone else to, they'll keep the time themselves and then send those time records along with whatever forms to an independent company, and the independent company will do the payroll processing for them. Again, that happened, I know, when I worked at a church, there were like 4 employees. So obviously, none of us knew how to do payroll. This was a long time ago, fresh out of college. So the church hired like an independent, a CPA, a certified public accountant, that kept the records. We kept the general bookkeeping, but then the CPA did the taxes and the payroll for the company. So that's pretty common. Let's see. We talked about most of this. And you can read through it, making sure we covered what we needed to cover. So what we're required to keep if we're doing in-house payroll, or what we would be required, the outsourcing company to produce. Number 1 is a payroll register. So I know it's a little small, but you can see it's listed all the employees are listed, their hours worked, their rate, you know, if they had any overtime, and then all of their deductions, which we'll learn how to keep a payroll register. That's one of the things we'll do in this class. So we'll learn how to withhold, you know, Social Security, Medicare, and federal and state income tax. And so it's just showing, you know, they do like weekly payroll, for example. So for the week ending January 19th, these were the employees that got paid. This is the rate, all the withholding. This is our total payroll liability. So that's a pretty common document, okay? We also are going to keep an employee's earning record on each specific employee. And again, these are all electronic, I'd say hopefully, in 2018. Most payroll functions are electronic. So these are going to be kept within the database or whatnot, whatever software we're using. So this gets updated after the payroll register is completed. So this shows not only the earnings per period, but it shows cumulative earnings for each employee. So we can see from the beginning of the year, they've had 3 pay periods this employee has. It gives a little more detail about the employee themselves. So their name, their gender, what department they are, where they're employed, you know, their withholdings, their marital status, all of those things we need in order to process the payroll. So both of these, the payroll register, which does the, you know, pay period itself, and then the employee earning record are both required to maintain. Okay. So it's going to compile data from many reports, but again, most of the time we have a database where everything feeds in. So once you've put in that employee and all their information, it should automatically populate. Okay. And then I talked about that. A lot of small or even mid-sized businesses are outsourcing payroll, which is pretty common. And it just reduces some risk, you know, when we're taking that off of our plates internally, that you have the company that deals with payroll all the time is up to date on payroll laws. So, you know, you're not really questioning what's going along now, you know, what's going out. Because obviously with payroll, we work closely with the IRS as well, because you're dealing with withholding taxes that go to the government. So it's important that we get all those taxes calculated correctly. As we'll learn down the line in this class, you know, there are penalties that can be assessed by the IRS if we don't submit forms on time or if we don't submit the right amounts to them. So it's important to get it correct. Again, that's the basic chapter 1, like the laws and everything. I wanted to show you a couple of things just as we're looking, you know, moving forward. Chapter 2, we'll start learning a little bit more about the Fair Labor Standards Act, minimum wage, what defines an employee, and all of that stuff. So, with that being said, when you log into Canvas, and again, these are just kind of for your information, I've put a few links out under the Unit 1. So, for example, there's a link called New Laws. If you click that one, it'll open up in a new window. So I found this earlier today, just kind of summarizing the tax reform bill. So again, that got passed last year, I believe, you know, the end of the year, and went into effect January 1. So that really changed how wages and withholding on taxes and everything was structured. So I know it's small up there, but it's kind of an interesting read. We're not going to read through the whole thing, but I always find it important in this class to kind of, again, give you supplements about what's going on right now in payroll, since it does change so much. So amounts of withholding income taxes they are predicting will be lower. And again, you may have already seen that. I know I did, moving from 2017 to 2018, that my paychecks were a little bit higher because of the change in withholding. So some of these are Social Security and Medicare changes. Again, we'll address those more in Chapter 3, but they have changed a little bit of the base on the ceiling for how much they're collecting Social Security on. Let's see if there's anything else. There's some stuff in fringe benefits and reimbursement to employees that changed. There's a new tax credit for family and medical leave. So that's important. So anyway, I just found that kind of interesting. And again, if you click even in this article, you can click on the tax reform bill and look at, you know, exactly a little bit more important, more specific stuff on how that tax reform is going to affect. You know, they've changed deductions and allowances and everything as far as when we report our 2018 taxes. So next year, when we go to do 2018 taxes, it's going to be totally different schedules and payments. Yeah, so it's like it's really changed the way, I know it was like, it'll probably be like, for us, we usually itemize, but starting in 2018, we probably will use the standard deduction because of the way things have been redone. So again, that really gets in more to tax law, but it does affect withholding rates too, because they have changed withholding tables, tax tables for withholding for federal income tax. So that's why we have seen a difference in payroll as well. So kind of interesting. So if you're interested in that, I like to read up on it. I read it when it first came out, and I haven't really gotten back into it, but there's like a new W-4 for 2019 that will help adjust your withholdings starting next tax period. So it'll fit with these new reforms. So obviously that's going to affect payroll because that's part of a payroll function. So it's pretty interesting. So you can kind of go through, or if you just Google tax reform bill, you can pull up, you know, the details on what it covers. So anyway, I found that interesting. And then let's see, I also put out just a link I found over Oklahoma minimum wage. And again, we're going to cover this more in chapter 2. But just so you know, it talks about 2017, 2018 minimum wage and FLSA laws in Oklahoma. So again, Oklahoma state minimum wage rate is $7.25, which is the federal rate. So it kind of tells you on a 40-hour week, that would be $290 a week, $15,080 for the year. So it really kind of puts it into perspective what a minimum wage worker is earning. And it goes into a little more details. It tells us, you know, this minimum wage has been in place since 2008. So that's a long time with inflation and everything that our minimum wage has stayed the same. Kind of scary. Again, that's federal. The $7.25 is federal, and we're just following that. We're not increasing it. So I found some of that interesting. You can read through overtime, how it's calculated in Oklahoma, and also kind of specific workers, which again we'll look at more next chapter. But if someone's under 20, and these are also some of these are federal laws as well. We can pay someone under 20 a lower rate of $4.25 for the first 90 days of employment for training purposes. Student minimum wage, you'll see that too. If you're a full-time high school or college student who works part-time, sometimes you'll get paid 85% of the minimum wage. Now this isn't just everywhere. This is usually like at an educational institute. Like when I worked for the college, when I was in college, I received that wage. 85% of the minimum wage. If you go get a job at 7-Eleven, they're going to pay you 7-Eleven rates. So you can still get, you know, more, but they have the right to offer full-time high school and college students 85% wages. So kind of interesting. And that's only 20 hours a week. So again, you're looking more at like work-study programs that are limited. And that's what mine wasn't truly work-study, but I worked 20 hours on campus. And so that's why it fell under that guideline. So it's not everywhere. If you go get a job at Chick-fil-A, you know, they're going to pay you the same. Where's our Chick-fil-A? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, that's much better, right? Much better. It's almost double. So we'll take that, much better. And then it goes into tipped minimum wages as well, which we're not going to get into until next chapter. So I'm not going to cover that.
So that only Oklahoma or
Yeah, it's similar. It's they're federal laws. So again, the state itself can set their own and say, okay, you're going to get paid this rate. It just can't be below the federal. Yeah. And then again, it's more for chapter 2, but just to show you, it's kind of interesting. If you go under the chapter 2 PowerPoint, there's a minimum federal and state wages you can click on. That's another link. I put it in here a little differently. So this one's kind of interesting. Again, they're talking, there's an ad, if I can get that closed. Okay, there it goes. The federal minimum wage is $7.25, but if you scroll down, you see a nice map, and it shows you minimum wage by state. So that I found kind of intriguing, again, because we talk about on the federal level. So I know it's kind of hard to see the difference between like the green and blue, but all the states in green, like Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, Idaho, all pay the $7.25 per hour.
So if they have no law, do they have to pay the $7.25 since it's federal?
They do, yeah. Yep, they do. And then most are higher. I would have to look into these that are lower than federal minimum. I don't know how they're getting away with paying $4 an hour in Montana. That's interesting. But as you can see, a lot of states, especially those with higher cost of living, California, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, pay over $10 an hour for minimum federal, or not minimum federal, minimum state wages. Again, if you were to research like cost of living though, obviously some of those states have much higher cost of living. So when you kind of put that into consideration, you may not be getting much more per hour. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting, and I like the visualness of it where you can actually see where states kind of lie. It's not any certain sector though, as you can see, it's just kind of spread out who pays more and who pays the federal. And then down here they have more information. They list all the states. And then like on New York, for example, they're saying 70 cents indexed annual increases starting December 31st of this year. So by 2020, it'll be up to $12.50. So they already have plans in place to continue to increase that as an incremental increase. And then starting January 1st of 2021, it'll be adjusted annually for inflation until it reaches $15 an hour. So some states are more progressive about how they do this. And then some just, keep it at $7.25 until the federal changes. So anyway, I just found that interesting that you can read through it and see there's a little bit more information on there, but mainly just minimum wage rates on there for the different states. They do have lower ones, like Montana and Wyoming. Oh, like what it, let's look at Montana. Okay, so there's the caveat. It says $8.30, $4 for businesses with gross annual sales of $110,000 or less. So that's where they're getting that $4. I was wondering because the federal is $7.25, and so to get under that, it has to be an exception, which there's always exceptions. So that makes sense. If they're a very small company, they can pay less, but their actual, I feel like they could be more clear in that in the visual. So yeah, I'm sure it's the same for Wyoming. $5.15 if federal regulations do not apply. So they do have some options there. So again, when I come across articles or something that applies to what we're talking about, and especially if it's relevant and recent, then I'll throw them out here. Just, you're not required to read them, but again, I just find it interesting, especially as accounting students, to kind of keep up with the changing laws and taxes and everything that affects what we do. Because we will see it affect us in one form or another, if just not personally, right? So it's always good to be aware of what's going on. Are there any questions on anything in chapter 1, like anything from the adaptive learning quiz or that you read? That's pretty good. Alrighty. Well, I think I'm done.